October 1st, 331 BC, near the village of Gaugamela, in the heart of Mesopotamia. Imagine standing on an open plain, with nowhere to hide. No hills, no forests, no walls, just flat land stretching to the horizon. Dust hangs in the air. The ground trembles beneath tens of thousands of marching feet. Ahead of you stands the largest army the ancient world has ever assembled. For the men facing it, survival seems mathematically impossible. By sunset, one of the greatest empires in history will cease to function, not because it was destroyed piece by piece, but because its center will collapse in a single afternoon. This is the story of how 47,000 soldiers toppled an empire. At dawn, the Persian army finishes forming its lines. 250,000 men drawn from every corner of the known world. Cavalry raised from childhood, infantry hardened by decades of imperial campaigns, war chariots fitted with blades meant to tear through flesh and bronze, elephants brought from the east living weapons designed to shatter formations before battle even begins. This force was not assembled to fight a battle, it was built to end a war. At its center stands Darius III, the King of Kings, ruler of Asia, master of cities, treasuries, and supply routes that stretch from the Aegean to the Indus. For generations, armies have been taught a single truth: you do not challenge the Persian king in open ground. You submit her, you are erased. Facing him is an army barely 1/5 the size, 47,000 Macedonians and Greeks. No reserves, no second army waiting behind them. If this force breaks, the campaign ends here, not tomorrow, not next year, today. They are led by a king barely 25 years old. Alexander has never lost a battle, but he has never faced anything like this. 5 years earlier, he crossed into Asia with an army smaller than this one, not to negotiate, not to test Persian strength, but to punish the empire that once burned Greek cities and to prove that Macedon now ruled the battlefield. At the Granicus River, he charged directly into enemy cavalry and nearly died beneath a raised axe. He survived. The Persian commanders did not. At Issus, Darius himself came to stop him. The battlefield was narrow. The Persian numbers meant nothing. Alexander rode straight at the king, and for the first time in history, the King of Kings turned and fled, abandoning his army, his family, and his authority in a single moment. That moment changed everything. Cities fell not because they were besieged but because belief collapsed. Tyre resisted. After 7 brutal months, it was annihilated. Egypt opened its gates and crowned Alexander as pharaoh. Victory followed victory, each one decisive, personal, irreversible. But Darius survived, and this time, he learned there would be no narrow passes, no rivers to negate numbers, no accidents of terrain. Darius chose the battlefield himself, wide, flat, prepared, cleared of obstacles, so his chariots could run freely, a place where cavalry could encircle, a place where numbers would finally matter. Gaugamela. On the night before the battle, some Macedonian officers urged a night attack. Strike first, avoid the trap. Alexander refused. He wanted the Persian king to see him, to face him, to lose in daylight. While the Persian camp burned with confidence, Alexander walked the field alone. He studied the ground Darius trusted, and he saw exactly where the empire would break. At sunrise, the lines form. This is not two armies preparing to clash. This is an empire daring the world to challenge it, and an outnumbered king preparing to risk everything not to defeat an army, but to strike at the one thing holding it together. At first glance, the Persian line seems endless. On the left, Bessus commands the elite cavalry of Bactria and Scythia men, who have ridden since childhood, fast and aggressive, positioned to sweep around any exposed flank. On the right, Mazaeus anchors the line with cavalry from Syria and Mesopotamia, veterans of imperial warfare, steady and disciplined. At the center stands Darius himself, elevated above the field, surrounded by his royal guard. From his position, the entire battlefield is visible. This is power made physical. In front of the Persian infantry, 200 scythed chariots wait in silence, blades fixed to their wheels, designed to carve corridors of death through tightly packed formations. Behind them, towering above the men, stand war elephants from India, weapons meant to break morale before steel ever meets steel. By every rule of ancient warfare, this force should crush anything in its path. Now look at the other side. Alexander's army forms, with no depth to fall back on. 31,000 heavy infantry stand at the center, the Macedonian phalanx, shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, each man gripping a sarissa, over 5 meters long. Together, they form a moving wall of iron points, lethal from the front, but slow to turn, vulnerable if broken. Behind and between them are 9,000 lighter troops, peltasts, archers, elite shock infantry. Their task is not glory, but survival, to intercept chariots, to harass cavalry, to protect the phalanx where it cannot protect itself. On the wings, 7,000 cavalry. On the left, Parmenion commands the defensive flank. His role is simple and merciless. Hold, no matter the cost. On the right is Alexander. He rides at the head of the companion cavalry, his personal strike force. Noble-born riders, heavily armed, trained to fight in tight formation. This is not cavalry meant to skirmish. It is a weapon meant to punch through a single point and never stop. Alexander rides the length of the line, studying faces. These men know the odds. They know there is no retreat. And then he speaks. He tells them the Persians fight for gold, for orders, for fear. He tells them they fight because there is no road home that does not pass through this field. Behind them is Greece. Ahead of them stands a king who believes numbers decide fate. Today, Alexander says, they will show him what discipline decides. When he finishes, there is no cheer, only silence. Then shields strike shields. Spears rise. A single roar rolls through the Macedonian line, not celebration, but commitment. The Persian army stretches far beyond both Macedonian flanks. Encirclement is not a possibility, it is the plan. Alexander understands this, which means he has only one option. He must move first, instead of advancing straight ahead. The Macedonian line begins to drift to the right. Slowly, deliberately, away from the level ground Darius prepared. To an observer, it looks like a mistake, the kind that allows an enemy to wrap around your flank and destroy you. But Bessus sees the danger immediately. Alexander is not retreating. He is pulling the Persian left outward, stretching it, forcing it to follow. And Bessus cannot allow a gap to open near the king, so he responds. The Bactrian and Scythian cavalry extend further and further to match Alexander's movement. Thousands of riders shift away from the center. Units that should be protecting Darius are now chasing space. The Persian line begins to thin. Alexander keeps moving. The ground grows rougher, less ideal for mass cavalry. Bessus hesitates. He cannot let Alexander slip past, but he cannot allow his horsemen to fight on unfavorable terrain. He chooses. The Persian cavalry charges. The moment the attack begins, the trap closes. The Persian left is now fully engaged, locked in combat, unable to redeploy. And in the center, Darius believes the moment has arrived. He orders the chariots forward. 200 scythed chariots surge ahead. The ground shakes. Blades flash. Dust rises. Behind them, the elephants advance. Massive and unstoppable. For a heartbeat, it seems the Macedonian center will be torn apart. But the phalanx does not panic. At the last moment, gaps open in the line. Narrow corridors. The chariots roar through empty space as javelins and arrows cut down their drivers. Horses scream. Vehicles crash and tumble harmlessly past. The elephants fare no better. Harassed by missiles, wounded, terrified, they veer sideways directly into the waiting spears of the phalanx. Formations close. Steel rises. The beasts collapse under wounds they cannot understand. In seconds, the centerpiece of Darius's plan is gone, and now, the Persian army is fully committed. Every reserve, every option, and that decision has exposed something fatal. With the chariots spent and the elephants neutralized, the battlefield fractures into chaos. On the far left of the Macedonian line, Parmenion is fighting for survival. Mazaeus has launched his cavalry in wave after wave, pressing hard, searching for a collapse. The Thessalian horsemen bend, but do not break. Infantry rushes to plug gaps. The line holds bare, but Alexander is no longer watching the flanks. He is watching the center. When Bessus committed his cavalry, and Darius threw his chariots forward, something happened that could not be undone. The Persian center thinned, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough. A narrow seam opened, where units had been pulled away, where commands overlapped, where order gave way to confusion. Most commanders would never notice it. Alexander does. He gathers the companion cavalry into a wedge, not a line, not a charge meant to scatter, a spear point aimed at a single target. He pivots left, sharply, abandoning the cavalry fight on the wing. For a moment, it looks like madness. His own flank is still threatened. Parmenion is still under pressure. If this fails, there will be nothing left to stop the Persian encirclement. Then, Alexander gives the order. The wedge accelerates. They do not aim for the infantry. They do not aim for banners or formations. They ride straight toward the gap and, through it, spears lower. Horses crash into men. The Persian center buckles under the sudden violence. Guards try to close ranks, but it is too late. Suddenly, the fight is no longer distant. It is in front of Darius. Alexander is no longer attacking an army. He is attacking the idea that holds it together. The royal guard turns to meet the charge. Men die where they stand. The wedge drives deeper, carving a path through the heart of the Persian line. Dust swirls. Commands are shouted and lost. Somewhere in the chaos, Darius sees it. The Macedonian king is coming for him. For a moment, Darius hesitates. He has numbers. He has guards. He has power. But power in the Persian system flows downward from one point, and that point is now threatened. Then, he breaks. For the second time in his reign, the King of Kings turns his chariot and flees. And in that instant, the Persian army begins to dissolve. Orders stop. Signals go unanswered. Units disengage not because they are defeated, but because they no longer know who they are fighting for. What had been an empire moments earlier becomes a mass of individuals trying to survive. Bessus pulls back. The cavalry scatters. Infantry throws down shields and runs. Panic spreads faster than any charge. Alexander sees the collapse and presses forward. He wants Darius. He wants the war to end here. Then a message reaches him. Parmenion is in trouble. On the left, Mazaeus is still fighting, unaware that the king has fled. The Macedonian flank is close to breaking. If it does, the victory could still turn into disaster. Alexander faces a choice that defines him. Chase the king and end the war, or turn back and save his army. He turns back. The companions wheel around and slam into the Persian cavalry threatening Parmenion. The pressure lifts. The line stabilizes, and only then does the battle truly end. Darius escapes, but his empire does not. By nightfall, Gaugamela is silent. The Persian army is gone, not destroyed, but undone. Its center of gravity has vanished. Before this day, Persia was still a functioning superpower. Its satraps commanded armies. Its cities controlled wealth and supply routes. Its king, however flawed, still ruled. After Gaugamela, that reality collapses. Babylon opens its gates without a fight. Susa hands over its treasury. Persepolis burns. Alexander does not conquer the empire city by city. He removes the keystone that holds it together. Yet the war is not over. Darius still lives. And as long as he does, resistance can still form. Alexander will march east, not for land, but for legitimacy. Into mountains, into narrow passes, toward a final attempt to do what Gaugamela could not. To stop him, Alexander does not pause to celebrate. There is no victory parade, no moment of rest. Gaugamela has shattered the Persian command structure, but Alexander understands something most conquerors do not. Empires do not truly die when armies lose. They die when legitimacy disappears. And as long as Darius lives, the idea of Persia can still survive. So Alexander marches. He moves south first, not to fight, but to absorb the heart of the empire before it can reorganize. Babylon opens its gates. The priests declare him chosen by the gods. The treasury falls into his hands without a single arrow loosed. From there, Susa follows, then Persepolis, the ceremonial soul of Persian power. When it burns, the fire is more than symbolic. It is a message. The old order is finished. Still, Darius lives. He flees east, toward Media and Bactria, trying to raise another army from the outer provinces. But Gaugamela has changed everything. Satraps hesitate. Governors delay. Loyalty weakens. Some still proclaim obedience to the King of Kings, but They prepare contingencies. Others begin to calculate their own survival. Alexander follows relentlessly. This is no longer a conventional war. There are no great set-piece battles left. What remains is pursuit across vast distances, through hostile terrain, against an enemy that dissolves whenever pressure is applied. In 330 BC, the chase leads Alexander into the Zagros Mountains. Narrow passes, steep cliffs, perfect terrain for defense, perfect terrain to undo everything Gaugamela achieved. Here the remnants of Persian command attempt one final stand. At the Persian gates, a narrow defile blocks the road east. A smaller force, led by Ariobarzanes, prepares an ambush. Rocks are positioned above the path. Archers wait in silence. This is the kind of terrain where numbers no longer matter, where discipline and formations fail. Alexander walks straight into it. The Macedonian column is struck from above. Stones crash down, arrows tear into ranks. For the first time since crossing into Asia, Alexander is forced to retreat. The road forward is closed. Losses mount. Momentum stalls. This moment is more dangerous than Gaugamela ever was. Here, Alexander cannot break a center. There is no king to chase, no decisive charge, just a narrow road and an enemy prepared to bleed him dry. For days, he searches for a solution. Then he finds a local guide, a path through the mountains. Steep, narrow, brutal, but it leads behind the Persian position. At night, Alexander leads a force through it. Men climb in silence. Horses stumble, some fall, none turn back. At dawn, the Persians realize too late. Attacked from front and rear, their position collapses. The road east opens. The last organized Persian resistance dies in the mountains. Not long after, Darius is betrayed by his own men, abandoned, wounded, left to die on the roadside. When Alexander reaches him, the King of Kings is already gone. With Darius's death, the war ends not with a treaty, but with absorption. Alexander claims not just territory, but title. He declares himself King of Asia. He adopts Persian customs, marries into Persian nobility, keeps Persian administrators in power. This is not conquest as destruction. It is conquest as replacement. Gaugamela made this possible because it was never about killing soldiers. It was about collapsing authority, about proving that numbers, tradition, and scale mean nothing when leadership fractures. That is why 47,000 men could topple an empire of millions. Because Alexander did not fight Persia as a state, he fought it as a system. And once that system broke, everything else followed. The consequences of Gaugamela echo far beyond Persia. In Greece, the news spreads faster than Alexander ever could. Cities that once questioned Macedonian dominance fall silent. Rebellion becomes unthinkable. The man they had feared as a reckless conqueror has now broken the greatest empire the world has ever known, in open battle, not through attrition, not through luck, through understanding how power actually works. Across the former Persian territories, a new reality settles in. Garrisons surrender without orders. Satraps swear loyalty, not because they are forced, but because resistance no longer makes sense. The empire did not lose a war. It lost its center. Alexander understands this better than anyone. He does not rule through terror alone. He leaves local structures intact. Taxes continue. Administrators remain. What changes is who they answer to. Where once authority flowed from Persepolis, it now flows from wherever Alexander happens to stand. This is why his army keeps moving. He pushes east, past the boundaries of the old Persian world, into lands no Macedonian has ever seen. The logic of Gaugamela follows him everywhere. When resistance appears, he looks not for the strongest position, but for the point where cohesion breaks. When cities submit, he absorbs them rather than erasing them. But this strategy comes at a cost. His army is no longer fighting for revenge or defense. It is fighting for permanence. The further east they go, the less familiar the world becomes. Languages change. Customs clash. Veterans grow restless. They have won everything they were promised and more. Alexander, meanwhile, is changing. The king who once fought at the head of his cavalry now spends more time governing than charging. He adopts Persian dress, demands Persian forms of respect. To some Macedonians, this feels like betrayal. To Alexander, it is a necessity. An empire cannot be ruled like a raid. Tension builds. Officers who followed him since youth begin to question his judgment. Old loyalties fray, mutinies simmer beneath the surface. Alexander responds the only way he knows how, by asserting authority, absolutely, the same clarity that won Gaugamela, now hardens into inflexibility. Yet even here, the shadow of that battle remains. Every rebellion he faces lacks what Persia lost that day, a unifying center strong enough to rally resistance. No challenger can stand before him with legitimacy. No king can claim what Darius once did. When Alexander finally reaches India, his army refuses to go further. They have marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, toppled an empire. They will not cross another river for another unknown war. For the first time, Alexander yields. He turns back. But the world he returns through is no longer the one he conquered. It is his. Roads carry his name. Cities bear his image. Trade flows along routes secured by the collapse that began at Gaugamela. Years later, in Babylon, Alexander falls ill. At 32 years old, the man who destroyed an empire dies without naming a successor, and almost immediately, his empire begins to fracture. Generals carve out kingdoms. Wars erupt. Borders shift. Within decades, the unity Alexander created is gone. But the world does not return to what it was before. Greek language spreads across Asia. Ideas travel where armies once marched. Cultures merge. A new era begins, not because Alexander ruled long, but because he broke something irreversible. Gaugamela was not just a battle. It was a proof that empires do not fall when they lose soldiers. They fall when they lose coherence. And on a flat plain in Mesopotamia, in a single afternoon, 47,000 men showed the world exactly how that happens. Long after Alexander's death, historians struggle to explain what truly happened at Gaugamela. Some focus on tactics, the oblique advance, the cavalry wedge, the discipline of the phalanx. All of it matters, but none of it is sufficient on its own. Tactics win battles. They do not erase empires. What made Gaugamela different was not how Alexander fought, but what he chose to attack. Every empire has a center of gravity. For Persia, it was not its cities, not its armies, not even its wealth. It was the king, the living symbol that unified dozens of peoples who otherwise had nothing in common. The moment that symbol proved vulnerable, the structure beneath it hollowed out. Alexander understood this instinctively. He never tried to destroy Persian forces completely. He never needed to. He aimed for moments that forced Darius to choose between standing and surviving. And twice at Issus and at Gaugamela, the king chose survival. That choice mattered more than any casualty count, because when the King of Kings fled, the empire learned something it could never unlearn, that he could. From that point on, no satrap could be certain. No army could be fully confident. Loyalty became conditional. Fear replaced belief. And systems built on belief do not survive that transition. This is why the Persian army at Gaugamela did not fight to the last man. It was not defeated in the conventional sense. It simply lost its reason to exist. Alexander's army, by contrast, was held together by the opposite force. Not fear but clarity. Every Macedonian soldier knew exactly why he was there. There was no confusion about command, no ambiguity about leadership. Alexander was not an abstract authority. He was visible, vulnerable, present. He shared risk. And because of that, his decisions carried weight beyond orders. When Alexander moved right, the army moved. When he charged, they followed. When he turned back to save Parmenion, the army understood why. This alignment between leader and force is rare, and when it exists, it allows smaller armies to defeat larger ones, not through strength, but through cohesion. Gaugamela is often framed as an unlikely victory. It was not. It was the inevitable outcome of two systems colliding, one centralized but brittle, the other smaller but unified. When pressure was applied, one flexed, the other shattered. The battlefield itself reflects this truth. Darius chose open ground to maximize numbers. Alexander used that same openness to create movement, to stretch lines, to expose weaknesses. What was meant to guarantee Persian dominance instead made its structure visible and, therefore, vulnerable. By the time the companion cavalry struck the gap, the outcome was already decided. The charge did not create collapse. it revealed it. This is why Gaugamela remains studied centuries later, not because it was dramatic, not because it was large, but because it demonstrates a rule that repeats throughout history. Power is not measured by size alone, it is measured by how well a system holds together when stressed. At Gaugamela, Persia failed that test, and the world that emerged afterward, Hellenistic, interconnected, transformed, was shaped not by the number of soldiers on the field, but by the moment one empire lost its center, and another proved it had one. The ripples from Gaugamela continued to reverberate through time, long after Alexander's empire fractured and faded. But the lessons from that day about leadership, power, and the fragile nature of empires remained timeless. In the years that followed, the world would witness a series of shifts that would reshape civilization. The empire that Alexander created, though short-lived, would leave a legacy far beyond the borders of Greece, Persia, or even India. The very structure of the ancient world had been altered in the blink of an eye. And it all began with 47,000 men standing against a force of 250,000. For the Greeks and Macedonians who followed him, Gaugamela became a symbol of what was possible, not just for them, but for anyone who was willing to take on the seemingly impossible and dared to challenge what others saw as invincible. For a time, the idea of Alexander's greatness spread like wildfire, fueled by the vision of a man who was willing to stake everything on one battle, one fight, one decision. But this myth of invincibility, while inspiring, would not be enough to hold his empire together. In the years following Alexander's death, as his generals turned on one another and his empire broke into competing kingdoms, historians began to ask themselves, was Alexander's greatest victory truly at Gaugamela? Or was it the ability to see, even in the face of overwhelming odds, that power is fragile and that leadership is the key to making the impossible seem achievable? It is in this light that the true genius of Alexander the Great comes into focus. His success was not defined by the size of his army or the number of his conquests, but by his understanding of what it meant to lead. He understood that the battle for the empire was not won through sheer force, but through creating a system of cohesion and trust that transcended the typical notions of strength and strategy. This is why, despite all the chaos that followed his death, the idea of Alexander the Great as a ruler, one who conquered with vision, ambition, and incredible clarity of purpose, lives on. It is not just the story of an emperor, it is the story of a man who understood the fragility of power and the value of leadership. When we look at Gaugamela, we see not just the clash of armies, but the clash of two very different ideas of power. On one side, the Persians represented a power structure that had existed for centuries, one that relied on size, strength, and the authority of the king. On the other, Alexander's Macedonian army, though smaller in number, had been built on unity and vision, qualities that allowed them to exploit the smallest cracks in the Persian armor and turn them into the seeds of a collapse. And so, the true significance of Gaugamela lies not just in the immediate aftermath, but in the realization that leadership is everything. Empires crumble, not because of battles lost, but because of the moments when their leaders fail to lead, or when their followers lose faith in them. And Gaugamela was, in essence, the moment when one leader proved that even the greatest empire could be toppled by a single moment of vulnerability, a single crack in the system that no number of soldiers could repair. As history marched forward, Alexander's name remained etched in the minds of future conquerors. His victory at Gaugamela was no longer just a military achievement. It became a symbol of the power of vision, of the idea that leadership could make the impossible real. This is why we continue to remember Gaugamela, not because it was just another battle, but because it was the battle that taught the world that true power is not about sheer numbers, but about how well an empire, a kingdom, or even a nation can hold together when it is tested. And for Alexander the Great, that test came on the plain of Gaugamela. It was a test he passed, and in passing that test, he changed the world. With Alexander's passing, the world he built began to crumble, but the legacy of Gaugamela never faded. The empire was fragmented, divided among his generals, but the principles established at Gaugamela would continue to influence military leaders, thinkers, and empires for centuries to come. In the centuries after Alexander's death, the world saw the rise and fall of many empires, each shaped by the same principles of power and leadership that Gaugamela had so clearly illustrated. The Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Mongol Empire, and even the British Empire would all echo the lessons learned from that single battle. Empires that failed to hold together at their core would falter, just as the Persian Empire did when its king fled. Alexander's vision of leadership transcended military conquest. It became a model for rulers across time, to lead by example, to show strength not just in battle but in the cohesion and unity of the people. Gaugamela was the ultimate test of this idea, where Alexander's ability to move his army as a single, cohesive unit defeated a far larger force, not through brute force, but through clarity of purpose and leadership. As time moved on, Gaugamela became not just a military victory, but a symbol of how the impossible could be achieved with the right leader, a symbol of how the greatest empires could be undone, not by numbers, but by the cracking of their foundation, their leadership. It showed that empires, no matter how mighty, were only as strong as the vision that held them together. When Alexander's successors fought for control of his empire, they failed to grasp the true lesson of Gaugamela, that unity, leadership, and vision were the true sources of power, not the sheer size of an army or the wealth of an empire. Without the cohesion that Alexander had built, the empire he had created splintered, and with it, the dream of a unified world under his rule faded. Yet Gaugamela remained a constant. It reminded future leaders that even the most powerful empire could be torn apart by a single moment of failure at its core. And it taught the world that leadership is not just about control, but about inspiring trust, creating unity, and proving that even against overwhelming odds, a single, cohesive force could achieve the impossible. As we look back at the Battle of Gaugamela, we see more than just soldiers clashing on an ancient battlefield. We see a pivotal moment in history, where one man through his leadership, his vision, and his understanding of power shaped the course of the future. And though Alexander's empire may have crumbled after his death, the lessons of Gaugamela have endured. They remind us that true power does not lie in numbers, wealth, or strength, but in the unity and vision of those who lead. For, at Gaugamela, 47,000 men proved that even the greatest empire in history could fall, not through overwhelming force, but through the failure of its leadership. Gaugamela was not just a battle, it was a lesson in leadership, a lesson that resonates through history, echoing through the rise and fall of empires, and reminding us all of the fragile nature of power. And that, ultimately, is the enduring legacy of Alexander the Great, not just as a conqueror, but as a leader who understood that true power lies not in defeating enemies, but in holding together the people who follow you.